All right. So can you guys see the screen I'm sharing? All
Yes.
right. Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, and I just have one more quick announcement. For everyone who's here today, I'll be sharing the copy of the slides with everyone who's in attendance today. So, more than welcome to take screenshots or take notes, but just know that you'll receive these slides, and I'll send that in a follow-up email tomorrow, along with other free links to free resources and things like that. That's all I have.
Sorry, just quick introduction. We don't have a sign-in sheet, but I can make one real quick and I'll just send in the chat, and then whoever wants to put their email so she can send you the slides. We'll do that.
Okay, perfect, Ilana. Thank you.
All right. And with that, we can go ahead and get started with the MCAT strategy session. I'm sorry for starting a little bit behind time. I'm sure we can make that up within the presentation. A quick note before we begin the presentation. I think generally speaking, it works best if you guys have any questions, or have any questions in terms of what you see on the presentation, or if you had questions to begin with in the first place. You can ask them at any point during the presentation itself. I do try and save some time at the end of the presentation just for general questions, just at the end. But at the same time, if you see something that you have a question about, feel free to speak up or put something in chat, and I will try and I will respond as soon as I can. Slide. So my name is Davis. I am an MCAT critical analysis and reasoning instructor for the MCAT at Princeton Review. I'm also I'm a happy grad of UCLA as well. I was class of 2020. And I studied cognitive science. And I started the gig around like 2 years ago, and it was a nice way to get kind of pocket money in the meantime in the space between graduating and then post-grad and all that kind of stuff. So yeah. And then you guys have already met Karen, who's here representing Princeton Review as the business development manager. And she'll also be the person to message if you have any questions in regards to our courses or further kind of related things regarding these types of presentations or resources that we can generate for you guys in the future. In terms of our agenda today, we will be talking generically about what the MCAT is. We'll speak a little bit about how Princeton Review tries to help our students. And then finally, should we have time, we'll be able to get into some sample passages and questions. And once again, I encourage, if you have any question at all during the presentation, feel free to ask in chat or speak up. Let me actually go ahead and move the chat into somewhere I can see. Okay. Awesome. All right. And actually, now that I think about it, I have a question for you guys. Karen might have already asked this question, but I like to know prior to my presentation. When are you guys planning to take the MCAT? Is it going to be in a couple of years? Is it going to be next year within the cycle? Let me know, and I can hopefully try and tailor my presentation to best suit your guys' needs. I think across the board in terms of my presentations, it tends to be a pretty even spread. There are students who are proactive and want to learn about the MCAT like as a freshman and stuff like that, and I certainly applaud them. And also there are students for which the MCAT is a lot more like relevant and right up in their in their future, and it's certainly very helpful, looking to be helpful for those guys as well. So two of you have already taken the MCAT. So it'll be hard for me to make my presentation valuable for them, I suppose, because I'm sure they do very well and they don't need to take it again. But at the same time, I think it's always nice to have people who've taken the MCAT in the presentation, because they always, you guys have already taken it. It's been more recent for you guys. I took it a few years back, so you guys have a better idea of how the pacing is, all the studying process, all that kind of stuff. So I may certainly ask for your guys' opinions, and I'm sure those will be very valuable. So we'll start with generic information. So the MCAT is the medical college admissions test. It's required for admission to most medical schools, and is a computer-based exam that tests physical and biological sciences, verbal reasoning, and writing skills. Reading one more comment by Shant. We'll be taking sometime in 2022, so that's coming right up. Let's see. Right. So it's an exam that you only want to take. It's a 7.5-hour exam that you only want to take ideally once. So the name of the game is to try and prepare as thoroughly as possible the first time around. Admissions officers use the MCAT as a predictor of your success in medical school. The exam is designed to test the skills you use when you get there, including basic science, verbal reasoning, and writing ability. The MCAT, of course, has the reputation of being one of the most challenging standardized tests. In Canada and Canadian medical schools, most schools weigh your MCAT scores very, very heavily. Many schools, both in Canada and US, set minimum cutoff MCAT scores that applicants must meet in order to be considered. I always like to say, excuse me, I always like to say that the MCAT doesn't necessarily predict who will be a good doctor, but it does give good indication about who can handle the rigors of medical school, feature standardized tests, and pass the USMLE, which is the US Medical Licensing Examination. We can delve a little bit into the sections right away. So the MCAT consists of 4 sections that always occur in the same order. The first section you'll see is the chemical and physical foundations of biological systems. Shorthand, it's called ChemPhys. It's designed to test introductory level bio, OChem, inorganic chem, and physics concepts, as well as biochemistry concepts taught at the level in many colleges and universities. You'll notice right here that there's a kind of a generic breakdown of the distribution of topics that tends to be on this section. This is not necessarily a hard and fast rule, but rather it's kind of a guideline of the way that the exam in this section tends to be distributed among these different topics. So if you're taking it, it will really depend on the day that you end up taking the test. Some tests end up having a lot more physics. So like one of my friends took a test that he pretty much thought was around 40% physics, and general chemistry was only around 15%. I'm just throwing out numbers there, but I think the main takeaway is that it tends to be distributed in this manner, but it is not necessarily a hard and fast rule. After a short break, you'll face the critical analysis and reasoning skills section, which involves reasoning beyond the text and within the text. Let's see. The section is overall designed to test your comprehension, analysis, and reasoning skills by asking you to critically analyze information provided in passages. And this can include content from ethics, philosophy, studies of diverse cultures, population health, overall a really wide range of social sciences and humanities disciplines. And of course, they will provide all the information you need to answer the questions in the passages and questions themselves. 1% physics is certainly too much physics for me as well, Liana. So it looks like we're all agreeing. Yeah, physics is a bit of a bore. Oh, did not mean to do that. Whoops. Okay. So After that, you have an optional lunch break, which I do recommend that you take. And then it's on to the biological and biochemical foundations of living systems. This section is designed to test introductory level bio, OChem, and inorganic chemistry concepts. As you can tell from the description here, Gen Chem and OChem are certainly in small part of the bio and biochem foundations of living systems. Let's see. Once again, the same kind of theory applies, where of course this tends to be the distribution of topics on this section of the exam, but it can be different depending on the luck of the draw, I suppose. I certainly look forward to those breaks as well. And I think when we start talking about, I suppose, test skills and approach to the MCAT, I think, thinking about those breaks certainly comes into play. But yes, the breaks are overall optional, and I recommend that you take every single one. Finally, after a break, you'll have the psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior, also known as psych-soc. This section is designed to test psychology, sociology, and biology concepts that provide a solid foundation for learning in medical school about the behavioral and social cultural determinants of health. I think the other thing that I like to note for this section is that this section also tests the basic research methods and statistics concepts that are relevant to psychology research and sociology research. Now, the majority, if not all of the students that are taking the MCAT have already taken just like the generic pre-med, bio courses, chem courses, psych courses, and those all compared with the physics labs. But not all students have taken psychology courses, and certainly not all students have experience doing psychology research. So it's important to note that you do need to have an understanding of those kinds of things for this section. So with that in mind, this question becomes very relevant. This tends to be the question that students across the board have the most, and it's when should I take the MCAT? And at the end of the day, the answer is straightforward. You should take it when you've taken all the prerequisite coursework, and most importantly, when you feel prepared to take it. And as we can kind of expect, the prerequisite courses include biology, physics, Gen Chem, OChem, and the flex positions start to become biochemistry, psychology, and sociology. Now, back when I took Biochem 153A at UCL, it was a Chem 153A at UCLA. I think I took it with Tiansen. I don't know if she's teaching anymore, but my TA was Miss Awad, who I believe is now Professor Awad. And she was very, very helpful. I suppose that's a bit of a side note, but the point is that sometimes it's difficult to be able to fit those last three quote unquote prerequisites into the 2 years of prerequisite coursework prior to taking the MCAT. Let's say you're on track, you want to go into medical school directly out of college without taking a gap year. This will put you on track to take the MCAT coming out of sophomore year. So in the summer between sophomore year and junior year, that would be kind of the time, one of the standard quote unquote ideal times to take the MCAT. And it can be difficult to fit in all of those courses below prior to taking the MCAT. So Ileana takes the lead and talks about the Soc classes, and I think I'll go ahead and lump the psychology courses in there as well, because psych and Soc, those tend to be the courses that students take the least of. Sometimes students are able to, I would say actually the majority, flexibly speaking, of students are able to take biochemistry prior to taking the MCAT. So psych and Soc, certainly very relevant to the course, to the MCAT, and can certainly benefit you a lot. It seems like actually quite a few students in the chat are very are knowledgeable about this, so that's fantastic. I agree with all of them. Sociology, certainly, I actually, like Ileana, I never took a sociology class prior to the MCAT. So it was there was a decent amount of new stuff that I had to grind and get into my head. And having taken a course would have certainly helped. AP Psych is also relevant. If you remember all your stuff from AP Psych in high school, more power to you. You're gonna probably gonna crush the MCAT. But I was not one of those people, and I kind of forgot a lot of that kind of stuff. So psychology and sociology certainly can be valuable, but I would by no means call them a hard prerequisite. The real question is biochemistry, which a lot of students have heard that it's very relevant to the MCAT, and it absolutely is. I would agree. It's one of the more difficult questions I tend to get is, I haven't taken biochemistry, but I want to take the MCAT prior to, so-and-so date. And, it's hard. It's hard because it seems like it actually feels like a pretty significant decision. Because if you don't take the MCAT at X date, let's say, then maybe that puts you on track to actually take a gap year. So there's inherently a slightly different question that's a part of this, when should I take the MCAT question? And so I will say this. Number one, I think biochemistry is hugely relevant to the MCAT. Namely because the MCAT loves to focus on questions that synthesize different topics. And maybe those of you who have taken the MCAT can speak to this or offer your opinion, but the MCAT really loves to focus on questions that borrow and combine a lot of different concepts from different disciplines. And biochemistry kind of focuses on that heavily. It kind of focuses on all the different principles that you learn in biology and Gen Chem and OChem and applies them to the life model of a human body, for example. And so that's exactly what MCAT does. That it's pretty much a lot of the questions that they'd like to ask revolve around that kind of principle. So because of that, biochemistry is probably one of the most relevant courses on this entire list to the MCAT. You may not necessarily be learning as many new concepts during biochemistry, but they are certainly going to be the most relevant for the exam, in my humble opinion. The other part of that I kind of mentioned was the question about a gap year, right? And if you're in the position where you're kind of hemming and hawing because you don't necessarily want to take a gap year, but you don't want to necessarily, what if you're missing out by not taking biochemistry? Like, what if you're not getting as high of a score as you potentially can? And I think I will say this. I think a gap year has never hurted an application. As far as I've heard, as far as, who I've talked to, all the people at Princeton Review and my own research, have all agreed that a gap year has never hurt an application. It can only benefit your application. Now, are there med school applicants who don't need a gap year and can go directly out of college into medical school and do fantastic? Yes, absolutely. But a gap year is not going to hurt you. It's only going to benefit you. If at the bare minimum, it's another year of your lifetime that you get to consider whether you want to do medicine, and it's another year of lifetime of just life experience, which is going to be valuable for you if you're working in such a human, person forward field. So, for those two reasons, gap year can only benefit you. Maybe others can chime in on that specific point, but I will move on. And once again, if you have any questions on this, feel free to ask. So, having spoken on timeline, here's now a slide on timeline itself. I would say, so generically speaking, this is a sample timeline based off of your junior year if you're not taking a gap year. But you can see that, right around October is when the 2022 January and March to June registration opens. You can start to pre-register at that time. So I think there was somebody who was planning on taking the MCAT in that range. So that's relevant for them. November, January, you start drafting personal statements and asking for letters of rec. Excuse me. Excuse me. Around February, you finish up your first drafts of the personal statement and your activities and experiences for the MCAS application. And then you ideally submit that right around June/May. You're also somehow taking the MCAT by spring. And then that kind of shifts your application now to after submitting the primary application, which opens around the last part of May to June. I believe it was actually in June this year. Or actually, no, I think it was May. Then you start submitting secondaries in around the time frame of July and August, and that is on the earlier side. Your fourth year begins, and then you start attending all those interviews that you're getting right around August, all the way through February. Now, I would adjust this a little bit. I don't think this is necessarily the most realistic sample timeline, frankly. This is kind of the idealized timeline. What's realistic is that if you're applying to 20 to 30 schools, you'll probably have to the secondaries might take you a little longer than July and August, which is totally fine. And then because of COVID last year during the cycle, interviews were shifted by about a month. So some of you guys may have heard of like the generic advice that if you haven't received an interview by Thanksgiving, you should count out that cycle. That no longer appears to be quite so relevant. If anything, given that it's been about shifted around a month, you can kind of consider December, or Christmas time, your new expect to retool kind of cutoff. So, and this year's cycle is, I think, the same. The real question for AdComs, it appears this year, is that they're wondering whether they want to keep an online kind of application system to the MCAT, not the MCAT, to medical school, continue doing it via Zoom, or whether they want to go back in person. That is an ongoing discussion, but you certainly save time, so you certainly save money if it were online. But yeah, so I would say, I think, stretch this part of the timeline out a little bit longer. Here are the test dates for 2022. Registration opened on October. The fee is flat $325. And I think for those of you guys who are in the audience or who are going to listen to this recording later on, here's where I say pretty much the most important thing of this entire presentation. If you remember only one thing from this presentation, let it be this: sign up for the MCAT as soon as you can. Absolutely, as soon as possible. The date that your specific testing date opens up, when you can start to pre-register and all that stuff, do it the day of, do it the morning of, if possible. It's certainly worth sacrificing an hour or two of sleep to try and get the ideal kind of testing date and testing location that you can get. So let's see. For UCLA is on the quarter system, so the latest that you can take the MCAT in the summer is probably September 10th. So which means everyone's going to want to take it on the September 10th date, and it's going to be really hard to get it on the September 10th date. And the other thing to make sure that you note, excuse me, is that there are a finite number of seats at the closest testing center to your location, in terms of wherever you end up studying for the exam. So I'll tell you a horror story really quickly. It is my experience when I was taking the MCAT. So I actually went ahead and signed up very early. And and I got the latest date. It was August. It was sometime in August. It was the latest date possible, and it was the closest location to where I was. I'm from Santa Rosa, and that's kind of like 1 hour above San Francisco. It's very NorCal. Anyone from like Healdsburg or above, anyone further from NorCal is probably really mad at the fact that I said it's very NorCal, but whatever. Anyways, that's where I was studying for the exam, and that's where I was going to take the exam. Now I recognize that the testing location, the closest available testing location for me, and keep in mind, I signed up as early as possible. I got the best possible place I could have taken the exam. This place was 2 hours away via drive. So on testing day, I had to wake up at 5 a.m., drive 2 hours over, and, make sure I was getting there way ahead of time to make sure I'm not like some freak accident doesn't derail me or anything like that. I had to wake up at 5 a.m. and essentially take this test that I've been studying for around 2.5, 3 months. And that's not necessarily something you expect when you're thinking about the exam, right? When you're thinking about the MCAT, everyone's like, oh yeah, I have to study for 3 months. I have to make sure I do put my very best effort on the exam. Well, it's going to be harder to put your very best effort on the exam if you're taking the exam in a place really far away, or if you have to wake up really early. I honestly don't think I had it the worst. Some students end up actually just staying the night before in a hotel close to the where they have to take the exam, because there'd be no way for them to drive all the way over to their exam location. This is probably somewhat less of an issue if you're taking the exam in a much more metropolitan area, or not metropolitan, much more urban area. So like in LA, I imagine that there's many testing locations in LA. But if you're like me, if your hometown is a place that's not necessarily, it's more suburban, or maybe even rural, it's probably going to be difficult for you you'll have to figure out some sort of accommodations you'll need to make for yourself. And the fact of the matter is that that's only going to get more complicated if you are looking for, if you don't sign up early, because all the good spots will be taken like in a flash. It's not unheard of for students to have to cross state lines to take the exam. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, traveling kind of throws my whole mojo off. I don't really like sleeping in hotels. So because of that, please sign up for the exam as early as you possibly can. All right, there's my spiel, excuse me. Now, looks like Janet had a question. 3 months of studying ideal? So, great question, Janet. The ideal quote unquote studying schedule, the one that a lot of MCAT courses tend to revolve around, and the one that a lot of self-studiers tend to revolve around, is that you study for it all throughout summer, and you take it at the end of summer. So for y'all, essentially you guys get out sometime in June, maybe you take a week off, chill out, and you start studying for the exam. So that is, June, July, you have the full month of July, you have the full month of August, and then you have a sliver of a month in September, which rounds out to around 3 months, 2.5. And that is pretty much, one of the ideals that you can ever approach in terms of studying for the MCAT. You just put everything else aside, just put your head to a table for 2.5, 3 months, and then you get it over with. The other benefit of being in that kind of time frame is that you don't necessarily suffer kind of the loss of studied material in terms of what you study at the very beginning. like if you stretch it out to like 4 months, it's more than likely that you'll end up forgetting some of the stuff that you studied in May when you have to take it in September, right? And so ideally you want to have a nice condensed study time, I suppose. So by those reasons, I would call 2.5 to 3 months of studying ideal. Yes. Now, are there other schedules that work that students have to do? Yes, and students certainly get very good scores by doing other schedules as well. In my book, though, just because of the aforementioned reasons that I talked about, the 2.5, 3 months is ideal. Great question. All right, so MCAT scoring. So each section is broken down by itself and has a score range of 118 to 132 with a mean score of around 125. This averages out to adds up to a composite score of around from 472 to 528 with a mean score right of 500. Now the mean and the median are aligned in this case because the MCAT is a curved exam, which means that they do adjustments based off of the aggregate score distribution. Now, it's not curved exactly like your courses at UCLA. It's not curved like 14A or anything like that. Essentially, it has been pre-curved with the mountains and mountains of data that AAMC has access to, given their previous administrations of the MCAT. The curve has already been pretty much constructed. But it is important to note that the exam is curved because this will affect how your exam gets scored. And I'll kind of get into that on the next slide. Other generic points, it's a multiple choice exam. 4 choices per question, it's all digital. No guessing penalty, which means you should never leave anything blank. Scores are based off of numbers of correct answers. Okay, so as I was talking about before, the average score, the mean score around 500 is aligns close to 50, to the 50th percentile. Now, in the past, it aligned more closely, but the trend that the data shows is that over the years, students tend to do better on this, better and better on the exam, such that the 500 as a percentile rank is now downshifted all the way to 45, to the 45th percentile. For those of you that don't know what that means, essentially what it means is that if you're scoring, let's say it's 502. If you're scoring at 502, it means that you and 52% of all students who've taken the exam are scoring at that level or below. So 502, the cutoff of 502 encapsulates 52% of all students within that cycle who have taken the exam. I like to show this slide a lot just because I think it puts in perspective some of the standout scores that many students hear about. Now, the ad that Princeton Review unknowingly runs every single time that you Google Princeton Review, and then you see it's pretty much all you see on YouTube. They talk about how the MCAT is hard and the MCAT is stressful. The goalpost score that the Princeton Review has decided upon to showcase is 510. And in the past, it used to be right around the 80th percentile. And I would say for a lot of students who hear about scores and have done their research prior to the exam, especially because I'm speaking to you guys at UCLA, I think a lot of you guys are high achievers and have high expectations of yourselves. The score that tends to get thrown around a lot is 515. 515 is seen as a good score, a score that you can certainly be, happy about, that you can apply to medical school with. Those are all very true things. But I do want to point out that nowadays, 515 is the 90th percentile, which is probably not what the majority of students were thinking when they heard 515, because it seems like everyone and their mother is getting a 515. That's not true. Only 10% of students are getting a 515 or above on the exam. Now, as I mentioned before, 515 is still a very, it is all of those things that I mentioned before. It is a respectable score. You can apply to the majority of medical schools in the US with that score. But I think, you know, it's not a 99th percentile score, like 520, like 520 plus. So I like to show this just because I think it puts the scores kind of in perspective, and it shows students that, you know, this is what it takes to get a score of 510. You have to be the 80th percentile, 515, the 90th. 520 used to be 99th, and now it's crawling down to 97th. And these trends will probably continue to shift. Actually, the other point I was trying to make. The other point I was trying to make that I mentioned is that this is a curved exam, right? So what this means is that let's pretend we're looking at the cars section, which is also historically the most difficult section if you're going based off of the mean score. What this means is that the number of questions that you can miss to drop a single point will change depending on which score range you are. So I said that in a really confusing way. Essentially, you can only, in the cars section, probably, you can only miss one question. And if you miss one question, that'll probably drop you to right around a 131. Maybe it'll keep you at 132, depending on the year. But it'll probably drop you a full point, a full stinking point. So that's just one, you get one question wrong and you're done from 132. You miss two questions, you'll probably drop to around 130. Two to three questions, I would say. 2 to 3 questions more. And then if you miss 4 to 6 questions, 4 to 6 to 7, you'll drop to 129. The point I'm trying to make, I suppose, is that the way that the scores drop is not linear. It is far easier to drop a score from, you know, you can miss pretty much one question in any of these sections, and that will put their score, the perfect score of 132, in danger. Maybe you'll miss around 2 to 3 for Chem Phys. And that'll probably put you at 131. Whereas you can miss, or you have a window of around probably 6 questions if you're more in the 120s range, or like the high 120s range, excuse me. So I guess what I mean to say is that that's kind of how the curve distributes itself, and you should also recognize how difficult it is to get that perfect score, or to even get a above 130 score, because the cutoffs are so brutal. And that's what makes these 8 points right here just an incredible kind of range out at the end. The curve normalizes on a normal curve distribution. You see that there's a strong taper on both ends, and that's what you're seeing here in the 520 range. All right. So the MCAT also has a unique aspect to it, and it's called the void option. So if you think you tanked, let's say on a score day, you just had a really just terrible headache and you just had a bad day, you had a bad test day. You have 3 minutes after completing the exam to void your score. You can only void scores on test day, right after taking the exam, like in your seat, and the 3 minutes after taking the exam. You cannot void scores for any reason at a later date. Scores cannot be reinstated at a later date, and scores do count as an attempt. You have a total of 3 tries every year to take the exam. You have a total of 4 tries to take the exam every year, and you have a lifetime total of 7 attempts of the MCAT. The reason why voiding exists is because the AMC, the MCAT, and the MCAS are all okay. Well, the MCAT is automatically distributed to your application to medical school, which means that every single MCAT that you take will show up to any single medical school that you apply to. So if you, let's say you take the MCAT and you get a 512, and you're like, darn it, I've taken, I've done so much better on my practice tests. I am confident I can do better the second time. So you take it the second time and you get a 517. For all intents and purposes, you are a 517 applicant. So go you, and they will pretty much take you as a 517 applicant. Now, let's consider another student who gets a 514. They're like, dang it, I've been doing so much better on my practice tests. I'm going to take it again and I'm going to do better. And they take it again and they get a 513. For all intents and purposes, you are a 513 applicant. Medical schools will look at your most recent test and kind of base you off of that. In terms of how they view the scores in aggregate, like as I was just talking about, they'd see the most recent one, but at the same time, they do probably, medical schools are trying to use a lot of different ways to cut out medical applicants because they get so many. And it's not necessarily the best reflection on you if you score, a pretty good score of 514 and then you take it again and you score worse. They'll probably be like, you scored well and why did you butcher this? They'll be like, what are you doing? So once again, as I mentioned, you're probably most likely you're going to be viewed as the most recent score. And yeah, okay, sweet. So at this point, let's go ahead and zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture. Importance of MCAT and GPA, because it's not just the MCATs, looking at the MCAT and GPA together, excuse me. Admissions committees will consider the totality of your application and not just one component. There are too many applications for each school to review. So because of that, most schools are going to go ahead and preliminarily screen applicants for GPA and MCAT. What that means is that if your GPA or your MCAT are below a certain arbitrary score, the rest of your application will not be reviewed and you will receive a rejection. As students select schools, you guys can use resources like the AMSAR, which is the Medical School Admissions Requirement book. It's an online book that you can buy for around 20 bucks from the MCAS or from AAMC, excuse me. I'll help you select schools that generally fall into the range of your GPA and MCAT. You can tend to view these as an average of each other. A strong MCAT can certainly help a lower GPA, and a poor MCAT will certainly negatively affect even the best GPA. Here is an infographic of what I just mentioned, 800K applications from 50K applicants and only 20K matriculants. More students are rejected from medical school than accepted every single year. Here is what your schedule looks like on testing day. As I mentioned at the very beginning, it is indeed a 7.5 hour exam. It is a doozy. So part of that, the duration of the test certainly demands strong content review, but it also demands stamina. This is essentially just what the testing center looks like. They're very concerned with security. It's supposed to be the gestalt here, I imagine. Instead of a scratch paper, testing centers provide a laminated notebook and a fine point marker. This can be a new experience for test takers, so which is why I just kind of bring it up. And yeah, so knowing the exam, as I mentioned, is as crucial to getting a good score, especially if you're a student that's looking to score in that vaulted 520 and above range. Knowing the test is just as important as having good content review. This means understanding the content, the delivery, and the timing of the exam. So on that note, this is what the exam is delivered, and this is how the exam is delivered. You have the passages on the left, questions on the right. If for those of you who have taken the MCAT, I'm sorry to give you guys PTSD, but stay strong. You see, there are a variety of tools that you have at your disposal when taking the exam. The left side, sorry, not the left side. You have highlight and strike through tools that you can certainly use to your advantage. And you also have the periodic table of elements. So maximizing your score revolves around a bunch of different things, but this is essentially the Princeton Review's approach to it. This is what we base our courses on. So number one is content. There's over 500 individual science concepts that are possible test topics. So you need to have a working knowledge of all the prerequisites that we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. Now strategy. I think the name of the game for the MCAT really tends to be time management. I teach the cars section, and that is the number one issue that the majority of students face for the exam. They run out of time in the cars section. And so improving your reading speed is pretty difficult within 3 months, but you can certainly focus on adopting a variety of different strategies that maximize the amount of time that you have. And, you can do the passages you like first. You don't necessarily want to do all the passages in order, particularly in the cars section. We do sometimes advise students. We always advise students to kind of glance over all the passages in the beginning just to see which ones are going to be the highest yield for you. And then we also advise students to sometimes skip a passage if we find it too difficult, because it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to abstract, all the majority of the correct answers for a single passage. And yes, the cars section for the MCAT can be that difficult. Techniques and thinking skills, essentially, the MCAT has shown to be moderately predictable in terms of how they approach specific questions, and TPR has methods that, kind of break those types of questions down. Practice and endurance, as I mentioned, it's certainly not enough to have good content review. It's more important, it's just as important, excuse me, to be able to kind of keep up your ability to deliver during the exam. And that certainly takes practicing under, test-like conditions. The last point of confidence, focus, motivation, and discipline is probably one of the sneaker difficulties of the exam. I think those of you who have taken the exam already, sorry to rely on you guys so much. I should pay you at this point. But those of you that have taken the exam already, understand that one of the most difficult aspects of the MCAT wasn't necessarily just the test itself, but keeping up the motivation when you're studying for the exam. Which is 2.5 to 3 months of being alone, grinding, studying with no window. No, I'm just kidding. Studying at home, and with not a lot of contact with the outside world. That can certainly be draining on a person, and it can certainly affect someone's mental health. And someone's mental health is always going to affect their ability to study and do their best every single day. And the fact of the matter is, students have strengths and weaknesses. Some aspects of the exam are going to be difficult for you. So it certainly happened for me, and I believe it certainly happened for the majority of students studying for the exam, where they run into something that's really difficult. They struggled with it when they were taking the course, and now they have to study again, and they're struggling with it still. And it can happen on an off day when you're already stressed out for the exam, and it can become very untenable to study for the exam by yourself. So I wish I had the golden kind of negative advice I could give here. I could just say something and everyone here would study like an absolute beast. But unfortunately, I don't know those words. But I will certainly say that I think one of the most beneficial things you can do for yourself when studying for the exam is to recognize that your mental health directly influences how much content you're able to retain and how well you're able to study. I remember for a pocket of time that I was personally struggling a lot with the cars section, which is the section I teach. And I would do like 3 passages every day, 3 or 4 passages every day, and I just butcher them. I just feel so bad for the rest of the day. So I took a break and I didn't look at cars for like a few days, and I asked I was lucky enough to be at home with my parents, and we went out and got dinner. And I ate all my favorite foods and stuff. I like foods. I'm sorry, I don't know where that came from. Oh, the recording is going to be terrible. But I had a very nice day for myself, right? In the middle of studying for the MCAT. It wasn't on my self-study schedule. It set me back a day in terms of my quote unquote schedule, but it was a very big difference for me. And for the days afterwards, I was doing much better on the car section. It gave me kind of the confidence to push myself through. So as I mentioned before, value your mental health especially when you're studying for the MCAT. But obviously value it in general. But you should recognize earlier rather than later than how closely related it is to your ability to apply yourself. All right, we are running out of time, so I'm just going to skip this part. This is mostly advertising. But essentially, we have help for homework stuff. We have help for courses. We have a lot of different test prep plans. I think the main point essentially here is that there's a variety of different plans for a variety of different students' financial needs and studying styles, right? So strategy-based, or like a full experience, or immersion, or a self-paced, etc., etc. There are a variety of kind of different types of comprehensive. There's a variety of different guarantees that Princeton Review offers. Essentially, the name of the game is essentially we give you extra work to do during our courses. And if you do all of it and you do all the normal stuff, then we do guarantee a certain score. If you don't get that score, we refund. We have our MCAT prep available for free on trial at that link. I believe it's still live if you want to check that out. And if you're someone that's interested in taking a course or have been considering taking a course, you can trial our stuff at that link, and MCAT free trial right there. Gives you a lot of high-end stuff. This shows you all the nice stuff that is part of the course, which includes probably to the highest amount of benefit to students, generally speaking, full-length interactive score reports and breakdowns of your strengths and weaknesses, which I think tends to be the difference between a standout incredible score and a very good score. Videos, drills, blah, blah, blah. And finally, we also offer help with the application process itself. Okay, so with all of that, is 7:29, which means it's almost time. And I also came a little late, so I'll stay around for if there are any questions. Now is certainly the time, and I'll certainly make time for you guys since I came a little late. So yeah, with that, we'll open it up to you guys if there are any questions. Excuse me. It would also be a great time to ask questions, I think, for those of you who haven't taken the MCAT, because you have access to your wonderful peers in the organization who are now available. And otherwise, they'd never help you, but now they're totally not to help you. That's a joke.
Also, if you guys don't have questions, you're free to leave, but we do encourage you to ask questions. And if a question comes to you at a later date, then you can send it to any of us officers and we could just like forward it along to get it answered.
Scroll about the first few slides. Yeah, sure. Chinaza. The first few slides, essentially, we're talking about the MCAT in a generic sense. So just talking about what the MCAT is, showing some of the content or describing the content on it. So essentially, what is the MCAT? The 4 sections occur in the same order. Here are the breakdowns. This is a general guideline. So it's going to be chemical and physical foundations, critical analysis and reasoning skills, biological and biochemical foundations of living systems, finally, and finally followed by psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior. Just talking about when you should take the MCAT, which is essentially when you've taken all the coursework and you feel prepared. Timeline. That's about. And the main point of the presentation that I want to make clear was that you should try and sign up for the exam as early as you possibly can. Score breakdowns, yeah, and the rest of this is. All right. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay. MCAT score slide. I imagine you mean this one.